On a cold morning at Union Central Station, 60-year-old Clara Johnson, dressed with quiet dignity, handed her ticket to the young gate agent. The woman behind the counter glanced at her, let out a small laugh, and said with a smirk, "With that accent, you do not belong in first class. Seat 44E will suit you better." A ripple of silence followed, and in that moment, something powerful was set in motion. What unfolded that day was not just about one seat on a train, but about dignity, justice, and the hidden strength of a woman who refused to be erased. As you listen to Clara's journey, I invite you to think about how you would feel if this happened in front of you. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe if you believe stories like this matter, and may your day be filled with kindness and courage. The winter sun rose over New York City with a pale silver light that spilled across the glass roof of Union Central Station, making the tiled floors glisten as if the entire hall had been polished overnight. Trains rumbled in the distance, their horns echoing through the cavernous platforms, blending with the murmur of voices, hurried footsteps, and the clatter of luggage wheels. Among the travelers streaming into the station that morning, Clara Johnson walked with a measured grace, her pace neither hurried nor hesitant, her expression calm yet quietly resolute. At 60 years old, with a crown of silver-streaked curls pulled neatly back beneath a wool hat, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had weathered storms much greater than the cold breath of January. She chose the train that day not because she lacked the means for more comfortable travel, but because she believed in walking the same path as those she served. Clara's attire was modest but refined, a dark navy coat buttoned to the throat, a soft scarf of muted burgundy tucked neatly at her collar, and simple leather gloves covering hands that bore the faint lines of age and tireless work. In her right hand, she held a well-worn leather satchel, its edges softened from years of use, while in her left she carried a crisp ticket marked with a seat in the VIP carriage. Behind her distinguished presence was a truth few in that bustling hall knew. Clara was the founder of a vast humanitarian foundation, one that had built schools in forgotten neighborhoods, shelters for children with no families, and medical clinics where none had existed before. Yet in this crowd, she was just another traveler, stepping into a world where appearances and first impressions often outweighed the quiet weight of legacy. At the counter, a young woman in her late 20s stood straight, her uniform blazer pressed and name tag polished to a gleam. Melissa had sharp features, softened only by the curl of her auburn hair that fell just below her shoulders. Her eyes, however, carried a restless edge, flicking quickly over passengers with the detached impatience of someone who viewed them as obstacles to be managed rather than individuals with stories of their own. Her smile, when it appeared, was practiced thin, mechanical, and brittle around the edges. She had been raised in a world where charm mattered more than sincerity, and where mocking what was different earned easy laughs among peers. That background had hardened into a reflex. When faced with someone who did not fit, she masked her discomfort with condescension. Clara stepped forward and handed her ticket with a polite nod. Her voice, soft yet clear, carried an accent shaped by years of moving between communities, where traces of the South mingled with the rhythms of Caribbean speech. She asked simply, "Could you confirm my boarding?" The moment the words left her lips, Melissa's eyebrow lifted. A fleeting grin tugged at her mouth before turning into a small, breathless laugh. Her gaze traveled over Clara's dark skin, her careful clothes, and finally returned to the ticket. With deliberate slowness, she leaned forward and in a tone that carried across the nearby line said, "With that accent, you do not belong in first class. Seat 44E will suit you better." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Conversations faltered, the shuffle of feet quieted, and even the low hum of the station seemed to fade into the background. Clara did not flinch, her eyes steady, her lips pressed into a thin line that revealed neither anger nor surprise. Yet the weight of Melissa's words settled heavily in the air, not because of their volume, but because of the cruel certainty with which they had been delivered. To anyone watching, it might have seemed a minor humiliation, easily overlooked in the rush of daily life, but Clara knew, as did many who had felt it, that such moments left scars far deeper than insults shouted in anger. Among the passengers in line, a boy no older than 12 clutched his worn backpack against his chest. Ethan, with dark hair falling messily over his forehead and eyes the shade of warm earth, had been waiting with his mother to board the same train. His clothes were plain, a faded hoodie, jeans with fraying seams, but his posture carried the quiet weight of someone used to shrinking into the background. He had heard those kinds of words before, directed at him by classmates who mocked the way his Spanish-tinged English rolled off his tongue. When Melissa's smirk cut into the air, Ethan's chest tightened with a familiar sting, and though every fiber of him wanted to say something, to defend the woman who stood so calm at the counter, fear pinned his voice to silence. Melissa tapped the keys on her computer with feigned efficiency, her lips curling in what she thought was a professional smile. She slid a new boarding slip across the counter without meeting Clara's gaze, already turning to the next traveler as if the exchange had been routine. Behind her, a colleague adjusted papers nervously, unwilling to intervene, while others in line shifted uncomfortably, some with curiosity, some with impatience, none with the courage to interrupt. Clara picked up the slip with steady fingers, glanced briefly at the new seat number, then lifted her chin ever so slightly. Her silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone weighing the measure of the moment, understanding its gravity, and choosing not to waste dignity in a place where it would only be trampled. Ethan watched as Clara turned and walked toward the platform, her back straight despite the insult that had sought to bend it. His mother, a woman with tired eyes and calloused hands, whispered for him to keep moving, to focus on their tickets, but Ethan's gaze lingered on Clara until she disappeared into the crowd. In her stride, he saw both the quiet strength of someone unbroken and the painful familiarity of being treated as if you did not belong. The image etched itself into his young mind, stirring a mixture of shame for his silence and awe at her composure. He wondered, with a heaviness far beyond his years, how many times she had endured moments like this, and whether he, too, would ever find the courage to rise above them. At the counter, Melissa smoothed her uniform, forcing a cheerful greeting for the next passenger, yet a flicker of unease tugged at her stomach. She pushed it aside quickly, convincing herself it was nothing more than a minor adjustment in the day's work. For her, Clara was just another face, easily dismissed, quickly forgotten. What Melissa did not realize was that in the echo of her laugh and the sharpness of her words, she had set into motion something far larger than she could imagine. For Clara, the sting of prejudice was neither new nor unexpected, but it was a reminder, a mirror of the subtle cruelties that countless others endured daily. And for Ethan, it was the beginning of a lesson, one that would linger long after the train left the station. The air inside Union Central hummed once more with the ordinary rhythms of travel, the calls of porters, the click of heels on stone, the distant whistle of an arriving train. Yet beneath that surface calm, a fracture had been made. A moment, seemingly small, had exposed the lingering weight of bias, not shouted but smirked, not overt but cutting. Clara moved on, silent and composed, carrying within her the knowledge that dignity, though tested, was never theirs to strip away. Ethan followed with his mother, heart heavy with questions he could not yet answer. And Melissa returned to her screen, unaware that the casual cruelty she had offered in seconds would ripple far beyond that morning, leaving marks on lives she barely considered worth a second glance. The train lurched forward with a metallic groan, wheels clattering against the rails as the city receded behind the great arches of Union Central Station. Passengers settled into their seats, some with the practiced indifference of daily commuters, others with the restless air of travelers heading toward new beginnings. Clara Johnson, having been reassigned from her rightful seat, walked calmly down the narrow aisle until she reached the crowded section of the lower carriage. The air here was heavier, filled with the mingling scents of damp coats, paper bags of food, and the faint trace of engine smoke that slipped through the ventilation. She lowered herself into the worn fabric of seat 44E, the number Melissa had so smugly chosen for her, and folded her hands neatly atop her lap. Though her back rested against the stiff seat, her posture remained regal, her chin lifted just enough to defy the humiliation she had been dealt. Around her, fellow passengers shifted with the weary impatience of those who simply wanted the journey to end quickly. No one knew who she was, no one recognized the countless communities her work had transformed, and that anonymity was both her shield and her burden. Clara had always believed that dignity could not be stripped by titles or wealth, but by allowing others to dictate how one carried oneself. As she adjusted the scarf at her throat, the faint buzz of her phone stirred within the pocket of her coat, discreet against the background of chatter and rattling wheels. Clara drew the device into her hand with deliberate care, shielding the screen from prying eyes. A single message glowed against the dim background. Ready. It was from her team at the foundation, the circle of dedicated men and women who had worked tirelessly under her guidance. For weeks, they had been preparing a campaign highlighting the quiet injustices woven into public systems campaigns designed to bring light where shadows had lingered far too long. Clara's encounter at the station was not the spark of a new fire, but the match to a torch already built, a timely reminder of why this work mattered. Her lips pressed into a thin, thoughtful line, and she slipped the phone back into her pocket, letting her silence speak volumes. The rattle of the carriage masked Ethan's restless movements a few rows behind her. He sat pressed against the window, his breath fogging the glass as the city blurred into streaks of gray and steel. The boy's backpack was clutched tight against his chest, as though it could protect him from memories he could not quite escape. At school, his accent had been the source of endless taunts, words meant to belittle his family's origins cut deeper than fists ever could. He had learned to keep his head down, to laugh when others laughed, to pretend that the sting did not reach him. And now, as he replayed the moment when Melissa's smirk had turned toward Clara, he felt a pang of recognition so sharp it made his stomach twist. Ethan's mother, seated beside him, was a woman in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled into a loose bun and hands worn from long hours cleaning offices after dark. She wore a heavy brown coat that had seen many winters, and her eyes carried both pride and exhaustion, the look of someone who had sacrificed much to keep her family afloat. She noticed her son's silence, the way he kept stealing glances at the elegant older woman seated ahead, and she touched his shoulder gently. "Mijo, it's better not to get involved," she murmured, her voice a mix of caution and fatigue. Ethan nodded, but inside, he could not shake the feeling that he had witnessed something important, something that demanded more than silence. Clara, unaware of this boy's gaze, allowed her eyes to wander the carriage. She observed the lined faces of tired workers, the distracted hands of business travelers scrolling through phones, the soft hum of a baby nestled against its mother's chest. In this space, stripped of privilege and pretense, she saw the very people her foundation fought to support. It was here, among the overlooked and underestimated, that she drew her strength. Her silence was not weakness, but patience, the patience of someone who knew that storms gathered slowly before they broke. She adjusted her satchel at her feet, its weight grounding her, as if the thousands of lives depending on her rested quietly inside. The rhythm of the train became a backdrop for Clara's thoughts, each clatter against the rails echoing like a drumbeat of determination. She recalled other moments when her voice had been dismissed, other times when doors had been closed simply because she did not fit the picture of power that others expected. Each memory was a stone in the wall of resilience she had built, and now Melissa's laugh was just another stone added to the structure. Clara closed her eyes briefly, breathing evenly, not as someone resigned but as someone preparing. For her, silence was never surrender. It was strategy. Ethan, restless, leaned closer to the window, but his eyes were not on the blurred scenery outside. They were fixed on Clara's stillness, her unbroken composure. He remembered the sting of classmates mimicking his words, the shame of walking away without a defense, and he felt a strange comfort in knowing he was not alone. Clara's silence mirrored his own, but where his had been born of fear, hers seemed born of strength. The contrast stirred something within him, a quiet yearning to understand how one could transform the weight of humiliation into dignity. He wondered if he would ever learn that art. The train slowed briefly at a small suburban stop, the doors opening to admit a flurry of new passengers. Clara glanced up, her eyes catching the reflection of her own face in the smudged window opposite. In that reflection she saw not only herself, but the generations of women before her who had carried burdens with grace, who had endured without surrender. She thought of the young girl she had once been, mocked for her speech, doubted for her vision, told that her place was always somewhere in the back. That girl had grown into the woman who now sat silently in seat 44E, not defeated, but biding her time. The carriage grew louder with the chatter of newcomers, but Clara remained an island of calm, her presence almost magnetic. Ethan felt the pull, though he did not yet understand it, and he continued to watch her from a distance. Clara reached into her bag and withdrew a slim notebook, its cover worn, its pages filled with notes and reminders. She opened it to a blank page and wrote a single word at the top: resolve. Then she closed it again, as if the act itself was enough to affirm what needed to be done. The train surged forward once more, carrying with it 100 small stories bound together in steel and motion. Clara sat in her reassigned seat, phone silent in her pocket, her hands folded neatly once more. Her silence, misunderstood by many, was not a sign of defeat, but of a deeper strength gathering quietly. Behind her, Ethan leaned back against his seat, his thoughts racing, his young heart tethered by an invisible thread to the woman who had turned insult into stillness. He could not name this connection, but he felt it all the same, an unspoken bond forged in the shared experience of being told you did not belong. The train rolled into its final station by late afternoon, the golden light of the lowering sun stretching long shadows across the steel platforms. Passengers shuffled off with weary steps, their conversations blending into the echoing cavern of arrivals, while the sharp scent of metal and oil lingered in the air. Clara Johnson descended the steps with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the journey, her satchel pressed firmly to her side. Though outwardly unchanged, inside her thoughts moved with quiet precision, every detail of the morning stored away not as a personal wound, but as evidence of a deeper flaw in the fabric of the system. She walked steadily to the waiting car sent by her foundation, its driver opening the door with a respectful nod, and as the city closed in around her, Clara knew it was time to act. Inside the car, the hum of the engine wrapped her in a cocoon of focus. She drew her phone from her pocket and opened the secure line that connected her to her leadership team. On the other end, men and women who had worked beside her for years waited for instructions, their voices low but charged with anticipation. Clara's message was brief, deliberate, and final. Suspend all contracts with the Central Rail Consortium, effective immediately. Begin transfer of pending reservations to alternate carriers. Freeze negotiations until further notice. Her words carried no anger, only the weight of resolve, and with them she pulled a thread that would unravel millions of dollars in agreements. Silence followed. Then, one by one, her team confirmed the orders, knowing the decision would echo across boardrooms before dawn. The rail company's offices, located in a glass tower near Midtown, were still buzzing with activity when the first alerts began to arrive. In the legal department, clerks frowned at emails marked urgent, contracts flagged with cancellations, and funds suddenly withheld. In finance, spreadsheets that had balanced comfortably only hours before began flashing red with losses and frozen transactions. By the time the operations chief was notified, nearly a dozen key accounts had been placed on indefinite hold. The number attached was staggering, tens of millions in projected revenue locked away in limbo, leaving senior managers scrambling for explanations. What had begun as a normal evening in the corporate rhythm now churned into confusion and panic. In her modest apartment across the city, Ethan sat cross-legged at a small kitchen table, his backpack discarded by the door, his eyes bright with the urgency of memory. His mother, Maria, was preparing a simple meal of rice and beans, the aroma filling the cramped space with warmth that contrasted the chill outside. Ethan leaned forward, speaking quickly, telling her everything he had seen. The older woman's calm grace, the smirk of the clerk, the cutting words about not belonging in first class, the way silence had been turned into strength. As he described Clara, his voice trembled with something he could not name, admiration mixed with longing. Maria paused mid-stir, the wooden spoon heavy in her hand, and turned to look at her son with eyes that glistened. Maria was a woman who had carried her own share of humiliations. At 38, her body bore the quiet aches of endless nights scrubbing floors in office towers where no one knew her name. She had once been mocked for her accent by supervisors, laughed at when she asked for better pay, brushed aside when she tried to defend herself. Hearing Ethan's story stirred wounds she thought had long scarred over. Tears filled her eyes, not from weakness but from recognition, for she knew the weight of standing silent in the face of cruelty, and she knew the rare gift of seeing someone rise above it. She knelt by her son and held his face in her hands, whispering, "Mijo, remember her. Remember how she carried herself. That is strength, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that changes things." The boy nodded, his throat tight, and for the first time he let himself imagine a future where he was not simply surviving, not simply enduring, but standing tall. He pictured himself older, speaking with the same steady tone Clara had used, commanding respect without raising his voice. That image rooted deep inside him, fragile yet alive, a seed of courage waiting to grow. He ate quietly that night, his mind circling the moment at the station, the way Clara had walked away with her dignity untouched, and he knew it was something he would never forget. Back in the corporate tower, the tremors deepened. Executives gathered in glass-walled conference rooms, their ties loosened, their faces pale, their voices rising in sharp bursts of disbelief. The name of Clara Johnson had not yet surfaced among them, but the weight of her influence was already pulling their carefully balanced system apart. Managers barked orders to their assistants, analysts typed furiously to find patterns. And yet no one could explain why so many contracts had evaporated in a single evening. The sound of shuffling papers and tense phone calls filled the building, an orchestra of panic playing to an audience of stunned employees. Clara, meanwhile, sat quietly in her own office, a simple room lined with photographs of children from across the globe who had benefited from her foundation's work. Her fingers rested lightly on a pen, her mind moving between the faces on the walls and the faces in the train carriage earlier that day. For her, the cancellation of contracts was not revenge, but accountability, a message written not in speeches or press releases but in the language corporations understood best. She was teaching them that dignity had weight, and that the cost of dismissing it was more than any balance sheet could afford. Her silence at the station had not been the end of her response. It had been the beginning. By nightfall, the rail company's board of directors had been alerted, their phones buzzing with late calls, their dinners interrupted by fragments of bad news. Numbers once projected as stable profits now evaporated in reports. Questions rose about oversight, about errors, about what could have provoked such a sudden collapse in trust. And still, no answers came. Within hours, the smirk of one clerk had grown into a crisis rippling through layers of bureaucracy, threatening the security of hundreds who had never even seen Clara's face. What they could not see was that the woman they dismissed so easily had chosen not to fight in their language of insult, but in her own language of consequence. In the quiet of her home, Maria tucked Ethan into bed, the boy still restless with thoughts. She smoothed his hair and kissed his forehead, her heart heavy with the knowledge of her own struggles, but also lighter with the hope she had glimpsed in her son's eyes. He whispered before sleep claimed him, "One day, I want to be strong like her." Maria smiled through her tears, knowing that even a brief encounter could plant dreams strong enough to outlast hardship. In that small apartment, far from the gleaming towers of power, the seed of change had found new soil. The storm that Clara had set in motion continued to rattle the halls of the rail company well into the following week. Inside their headquarters, tension clung to every corner, and the gleaming glass walls that once projected confidence now reflected only unease. Meetings were called at odd hours, memos circulated with sharp urgency, and whispers of accountability drifted from one department to another. Senior executives demanded answers, but few were willing to admit what had transpired at Union Central Station. To them, it had been an ordinary morning, yet the consequences now weighed like stones on their desks. It was in this atmosphere that a young employee named Lucas felt the heavy pull of conscience. Lucas was 25, slender, with dark brown hair often falling untidily over his forehead, and a pair of wire-framed glasses that seemed too large for his narrow face. He had joined the company fresh out of college, eager to prove himself, and was known among colleagues for his quiet diligence and tendency to avoid conflict. His uniform was neat, his shoes polished, but his gaze often betrayed the unease of someone struggling to reconcile ambition with morality. On the day of Clara's humiliation, he had stood only a few feet from Melissa, watching as her smirk twisted into words that cut deeper than any knife. He had looked down at his screen, pretending to work, but the moment had burned itself into his memory. Now, as the company scrambled to explain the sudden loss of lucrative contracts, Lucas sat at his desk late into the night, staring at a blank report form. He knew what the executives wanted: excuses about system failures, technical glitches, or customer misunderstandings. But he also knew the truth. Clara's reassignment had not been an error. It had been a deliberate act of prejudice, delivered with a laugh and buried under feigned professionalism. His hands trembled as he began to type, each word dragging his heart further from safety but closer to integrity. In measured sentences, he described the scene, noting Clara's composure, Melissa's derision, and the unspoken understanding among staff that this was not about policy, but about perception. As the report grew, Lucas felt a strange clarity. He included details of whispered conversations, of the subtle instructions from supervisors that image mattered, and of the way certain passengers were quietly reassigned when they didn't fit. He didn't name Clara outright, but he described her enough that no one could mistake who she was. By the time he signed his name at the bottom, his palms were damp with sweat, yet a weight had lifted from his chest. He printed the report, slid it into the internal envelope, and placed it in the outgoing bin with a quiet finality. Whether it would change anything, he did not know, but at least he had refused to remain complicit. Across the city, life moved on in a different rhythm. In a modest church hall decorated with faded banners and folding chairs, Clara's Foundation hosted a small community event that Saturday. The air smelled faintly of roasted coffee and fresh bread donated by a local bakery, and the stage was adorned with photographs of children smiling in classrooms built by the Foundation's funds. Neighbors filed in slowly, their coats heavy from the lingering cold, their conversations warm with gratitude. Clara stood near the back, speaking gently with volunteers, her presence calm and approachable, never overshadowing those she had come to support. It was here, by coincidence, that Ethan and his mother found themselves. Maria had heard of the free medical checkups offered through the event and had brought Ethan along, thinking only of practical needs. But as they entered the hall, Ethan froze, his eyes widening as he recognized the familiar figure across the room. There was no mistaking the burgundy scarf, the graceful posture, the quiet dignity. "Mama, that's her," he whispered urgently, tugging at his mother's sleeve. Maria followed his gaze, and when she saw Clara, she felt her breath catch, the memory of Ethan's story surging back in vivid detail. She squeezed his hand and urged him gently forward. When Ethan finally stood before Clara, his words tumbled out in a rush. He told her about Union Central Station, about how he had seen Melissa laugh and lower her seat, about how he had wanted to speak but could not. His voice cracked as he admitted the shame of his silence, his small hands tightening into fists as if to hold back the frustration of that moment. Clara listened without interruption, her eyes warm and steady, her expression free of judgment. When he finished, she rested a hand lightly on his shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "Not everyone finds the courage to speak in the moment, child. What matters is that you remember, and when the time comes again, you will know that your voice matters." Ethan looked up at her, his chest swelling with both relief and determination. Maria, standing close by, felt tears sting her eyes as she watched her son connect with the woman whose grace had inspired him. For years she had carried the fear of what silence cost, the shame of letting indignities pass unchallenged. To hear Clara's words, to see Ethan's face light up with hope, was like witnessing a bridge built across generations of struggle. Clara had not only endured humiliation with dignity, she had transformed it into a lesson, one that now lived in the heart of a boy who might one day stand taller than she could have imagined. The event continued with laughter, music, and speeches from volunteers, yet for Ethan, the world seemed to have shifted. He walked through the hall with his head higher, his steps firmer, feeling as if he carried a secret gift in his chest. Clara moved among the people with her characteristic humility, greeting each person as though they alone mattered most, her presence a quiet reminder that leadership was not about power, but about service. When she caught Ethan's gaze again across the room, she smiled, and the boy smiled back, no longer weighed down by the shame of silence, but lifted by the promise of courage yet to come. Back at the rail company, Lucas's report made its way through internal channels, landing eventually on the desk of a senior compliance officer. The stark honesty of his words could not be ignored, and murmurs of disciplinary reviews began to stir behind closed doors. Though Melissa's name was not yet on any official notice, the tide was turning, the truth cracking open the shell of denial. What had been whispered in corners was now written in ink, a record that could not easily be erased. The system had trembled under Clara's quiet strength, and now, piece by piece, the truth was forcing itself into the light. The scandal surrounding the rail company grew too large to contain, and by the end of the month, headlines blazed across newspapers and screens demanding accountability. Public pressure mounted with each passing day, journalists digging into internal reports and leaked documents, while advocacy groups amplified the story as proof of systemic injustice. Shareholders grew restless, and the company's reputation trembled under the weight of scrutiny. In boardrooms once confident and impenetrable, panic turned to reluctant acceptance. They could not silence what had been revealed. They would have to face the storm openly, not with denials, but with contrition. On a brisk morning, executives gathered at a press conference in a hall filled with reporters, cameras flashing and microphones poised. The CEO, a man in his 60s with thinning hair and a polished suit, stood at the podium, his expression grave. He spoke of regret, of responsibility, of unacceptable behavior that did not reflect the company's values. Behind him, a banner announced the creation of a new scholarship initiative, the Union Dignity Fund, aimed at supporting underprivileged students across the country. He emphasized that this step was not only a response to the incident, but a long-term commitment to equity. In the front row, Clara sat quietly, her presence unassuming yet unmistakable, her silence lending more weight than any words spoken on stage. When asked if she would accept financial compensation for the humiliation she endured, Clara's response was calm, her voice steady and low. She declined without hesitation, explaining that she did not seek personal restitution, but systemic change. Money cannot erase what was done, she said, but it can be redirected to build something better. Dignity must be the foundation, not a privilege. Her words carried through the room, captured by dozens of microphones, and the silence that followed was deeper than applause. For many listening, it was the first time they understood the true measure of power. Not in demanding repayment, but in reshaping the future. Behind the public stage, a quieter meeting had been arranged in a private room. Clara entered with the same composed grace, her scarf draped neatly, her steps measured. Waiting there was Melissa, no longer in uniform, her hair tied back loosely, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. She wore a plain blouse and skirt, clothes that seemed to sag under the weight of her shame. Since her dismissal, whispers had followed her, friends had pulled away, and the easy confidence she once wore had dissolved. When Clara appeared, Melissa's composure broke. She rose quickly, bowed her head, and words spilled from her trembling lips. "I was wrong," Melissa whispered, her voice shaking. "I let prejudice speak for me, and I thought it was nothing, just a laugh, just a gesture. But it was cruelty, and I know I hurt you. I know I played a part in something far bigger than I understood. I am sorry." Tears welled in her eyes, her hands clutching one another tightly as though holding on to the last fragments of dignity she still possessed. The room fell silent, every breath waiting for Clara's reply. Clara regarded her steadily, her expression calm but not cold. She let the silence linger, not to punish, but to let the weight of the apology settle fully. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, carrying both firmness and grace. "I do not need an apology for myself. What I need is for you to remember. A smirk, a laugh, a small act of disdain. It can wound a life, or it can alter a system. Let this mistake teach you to live differently, to treat others with the dignity you once withheld. That will matter far more than any words you say today." Melissa nodded, her tears falling freely, and though her career had ended, a new chapter of reckoning had begun within her. In the weeks that followed, the Union Dignity Fund took form. Applications poured in from schools, community centers, and families struggling to find a foothold in a system that often overlooked them. Among the first to be chosen was a boy from a modest neighborhood, a 12-year-old with earnest eyes and a stubborn hope. Ethan stood with his mother in a hall filled with students and families, the announcement echoing like a miracle. Maria clasped his shoulders tightly, her eyes shining with pride and disbelief. For years she had fought to give him chances she never had, and now here was a door opening wide. At the scholarship ceremony, Clara moved through the crowd, offering handshakes and quiet words of encouragement. When Ethan's name was called, he stepped onto the stage, his small frame trembling with both nerves and pride. He looked out at the sea of faces, then found Clara in the front row, her gaze steady, her smile gentle. As he accepted the award, he understood something profound. The scholarship was not just an opportunity for him, but a symbol of transformation born from one woman's refusal to let humiliation define her. After the ceremony, Ethan approached Clara once more, his voice steadier than before. "I saw what they did to you," he confessed softly, "and I was afraid to say anything. But I promise, next time, I won't stay quiet." Clara placed her hand lightly on his shoulder, her eyes warm with approval. "That promise is enough," she said. "You are the future, and the world will need your courage." The words sank deep into Ethan's heart, becoming a vow that would shape him for years to come. The day ended with laughter and music, families embracing one another, children running between rows of chairs with certificates clutched in their hands. Yet beneath the celebration lay something deeper, a current of hope that stretched beyond that hall. Clara had turned her own wound into a bridge, connecting past injustices to future possibilities. Melissa, humbled and chastened, had begun a journey of reflection. Ethan, once silenced by fear, had found the seed of his voice. And in the quiet strength of one woman's choice not to retaliate but to transform, an entire community felt the ripple of change. Clara left the hall as evening settled over the city, the sky painted with shades of rose and violet. Her steps were unhurried, her spirit steady. She did not see herself as a hero, but as a servant of a larger truth that dignity, once defended, could never be taken away, and that forgiveness, when chosen, could be the most powerful act of all. The world outside still bore its flaws, its cruelties, its prejudices. But within her, and within the children like Ethan, a new kind of future was quietly taking root. The lesson of this story is clear and timeless. True strength is not found in loud retaliation or in the pursuit of revenge, but in the quiet courage to rise above prejudice, to turn personal wounds into hope for others, and to choose compassion where bitterness might have lived. Clara's journey reminds us that even the smallest act of dignity can ripple outward, breaking walls of bias and opening doors for generations to come. It teaches us that the silent sacrifices of those who endure with grace can reshape entire systems, and that the truest heroes are often those who walk humbly, guided by love and a sense of justice. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others, to leave a comment with your own reflections, and to subscribe so that together we can keep bringing forward voices that inspire change. May God bless you and your family, and may He give you the strength to live with kindness, courage, and faith each day.